Guten Morgen, herzlich willkommen. Good morning and welcome to the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Bill Berkwhite and I'm the inaugural director of Penn's new Perry Worldhouse. When our doors open next fall, Perry Worldhouse will provide a new hub for Penn's international scholarship and global engagement, a home for events such as the extraordinary program we have for you today. It is my distinct pleasure to call this meeting to order and to introduce the 8th president of the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Amy Gutmann. She is an educational visionary who has championed and charted Penn's internationalization, including the new Penn Wharton China Center in Beijing and the Perry Worldhouse here on campus. A prolific scholar and visionary thinker whose 16 books and countless articles have dealt and grappled with the difficult questions of democracy and deliberation, identity and equality, the very issues that have animated the life and career of our distinguished speaker today. She is a transformational leader who has expanded access to a Penn education for students from the United States and from around the world, and has integrated knowledge, creating a truly interdisciplinary global university. It is my pleasure to give you President Amy Gutmann.
Thank you so much, Bill. We're very grateful for your leadership of Penn's Perry Worldhouse and for promoting Penn's global vision here on campus. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It is my great pleasure to welcome our students, faculty, staff, and community members. This is amazing turnout for amazing event. This is a very special occasion. We are going to be treated to an important talk by one of Europe's leading thinkers and statesmen. I want to begin by offering a very special welcome to German Ambassador Peter Wittig, who is here with us. Peter, would you please stand up so we can thank you for arranging this? We're honored today to welcome not only to the University of Pennsylvania, but also to the birthplace of freedom in the United States, the cradle of liberty. Welcome to Philadelphia, German President Joachim Gauck. Thank you so much for joining us today. This past Saturday marked German Unity Day, which celebrates the 25th anniversary of the reunification of Germany in 1990. President Gauck, at that time, probably didn't know he would become President Gauck, but he had already been leading weekly prayers for peace that gave rise to the protests that gave rise to the reunification of Germany. At that historic moment in 1990, it was President Gauck, it was his strong and courageous voice that helped usher in nothing short of a new era of democracy, human rights, and freedom for a newly unified Germany. That truly changed the course not only of German history, not only of European history, but of world history. It will not surprise us that President Gauck, a champion of freedom, human rights, and democracy throughout his life, began his visit to Philadelphia, visiting the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall. It will not surprise us that he will conclude his visit to the United States with a state dinner at the White House, hosted by President Obama. President Obama will salute our two nations' shared commitment to building a more peaceful and prosperous world. President Gauck has championed this noble cause from a very young age, under very difficult circumstances. In choosing to honor the University of Pennsylvania by his visit, and it is quite an honor, President Gauck has clearly selected the one university appropriate to his calling and visit. And I say this with all due Quaker modesty. Penn is home to the oldest academic program in German studies in North America. At a time when other colleges and universities in the British colonies offered only Greek and Latin, Penn began teaching German in 1754. And we hired our first professor of German 3 years later, 1757, the first professor of German at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, to be fair, this reflected the reality on the ground. When Benjamin Franklin founded the University of Pennsylvania, fully a third of this colony's inhabitants were direct German descendants. Those numbers have changed since as successive waves of immigration have come to Pennsylvania, as they have come to Germany from other nations and other parts of the world. Yet the fundamental relationship between Penn and Germany continues to thrive to this day through robust faculty research and vibrant student engagement. Every year for the past 3 years, Penn has sent at least one Fulbright scholar to Germany. And we are thankful for the critical support of the German Academic Exchange Service for making this and many other collaborations possible. We enjoy important, ongoing academic dialogues with our German colleagues in higher education, and we greatly value them. But let me tell a forgotten story from history about how the interchange began from deep historic roots with important national consequences. And this story, I believe, tells a lot about why we are here today and why it's so important to keep this history going, and why, by the way, academic research really enlightens us. So here's the story, which I dare say almost nobody here knows, in all likelihood, because I found this out myself by researching it. So here, it was in 1766 that Benjamin Franklin traveled to Germany at the age of 60, having successfully argued before the British Parliament for the repeal of the Stamp Act. Remember, he is still a British subject. And in his letters home, he indicated he was traveling to take the waters for his health. We would call it going to a spa today, right? But we know that Benjamin Franklin rarely did anything simply for personal pleasure. So for more than 200 years, historians have repeated this story and paid Benjamin Franklin's trip to Germany very little attention. But 4 years ago, Professor Jürgen Overhoff at the University of Hamburg, through his research, revealed that the wily Dr. Franklin was up to something much more than a spa holiday. In fact, our Ben we call him Ben. That's our kind of association. We're friendly with Ben. He spent the better part of a fortnight staying at the University of Göttingen, meeting with 2 professors who were recognized as the leading experts in German constitutional law. They were experts, especially in the federal constitution of Germany's Holy Roman Empire, a state of states that might possibly have applications elsewhere, as in the not yet federated United States of America. Keep in mind that at the time, Franklin was a loyal subject of the British Crown, yet a decade before the American Revolution, he already understood the need to forge a new kind of relationship among the 13 colonies. And he understood that better because of his trip to Germany and his learning about a federation of federations. that preceded ours. Ben Franklin then, of course, became the Constitutional Convention's revered elder statesman many years later. How much of these summertime discussions about German constitutional federation found their way into the arguments here in Philadelphia, we can only surmise. But there is no doubt that the deep connections between our two countries adhere and have built to this very day, which is why I am so honored at this time to welcome and introduce a leader, a statesman, a man who exemplifies the highest values of his country and of our two countries together. President Gauck has served as his nation's president since 2012, continuing a most distinguished leadership career in service to Germany and in service and leadership of the causes of human rights, freedom, and democracy. President Gauck is a leader admired and respected across Europe for a lifetime of advocacy on behalf of these values. We at the University of Pennsylvania could not be more honored than to welcome, and I ask you to please join me in offering a warm welcome to Germany's president, President Gauck. Thank you so very, very much.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much, President Gottman, for this very warm welcome. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please accept that I will deliver my speech in German. Thank you.
President Gottman, ladies and gentlemen, it was here in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, that President John F. Kennedy, in a speech to commemorate Independence Day on the 4th of July, 1962, put forward a groundbreaking idea. At the time, he proposed the creation of a Declaration of Interdependence to stand alongside America's Declaration of Independence. He suggested that the principle of national independence should be complemented by the concept of mutual interdependence, of enduring ties spanning the Atlantic, building on the idea of the political West, which is to say the idea of forging bonds between states brought together by liberal constitutional principles. In the United States and in an increasingly integrated Europe, President Kennedy identified partners that would be able to succeed in a task that no country in the world, not even the most powerful, could fulfill single-handedly: the task of fighting poverty effectively, promoting growth and prosperity in the long term, lowering trade barriers, avoiding currency turbulences, and helping, and I quote, to achieve a world of law and free choice, banishing the world of war and coercion, end of quote. In the words of the American president on that occasion, the United States and Europe should work together, and I quote, on a basis of full equality in all the great and burdensome tasks of building and defending a community of free nations, end of quote. Today, more than half a century later, I stand before you as a European citizen and as German president to underscore President Kennedy's words. I would also like to renew his commitment and to extend his vision to embrace a new era. For although we have indeed established an Atlantic community, this major project has not yet been completed. We have indeed confronted the evils of the times. We've even seen the end of aggressive Soviet imperialism, have overcome the Cold War, and advanced the work of European unification. But it is not complete, and old challenges have been replaced by new perils. It is for this reason that we must remember that at a time of rising powers and new challenges, the transatlantic partnership is not an optional alliance, one of several possible constellations. I am certain that the transatlantic partnership, and at its heart also the German-American friendship, of course, is, because I'm not talking about America and Europe solely, that partnership is and will remain the central strategic alliance of our times. At a time and in a world where terrorists are on the rampage, where autocrats and dictators ride roughshod over others, where states are failing and entire regions descending into chaos, where the central legal principles for our coexistence are no longer respected in some places, in this age and in this world of old and new dangers, the established alliance of free and democratic nations will continue to be the most important pillar of stability. The power of the like-minded, of those who have committed themselves to freedom and equality, the rule of law and human rights, this power is still the best hope for the world's persecuted and oppressed. And it is still the greatest hope for us ourselves. We will need one another in the future too, and we have reason to trust one another. Ladies and gentlemen, as federal president, I can hardly imagine a better place in the United States than Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn that is, to speak about the deep bonds that have evolved between our two nations and continents. And that was made very clear to me when I listened to what you said a minute ago, Madam President. It is something that I want to speak about, the ties that will bind us together in the future, because it's here in your city that the spirit of freedom lives on through the maintenance of the tradition that found its best expression in the Constitutional Convention of 1787 here in Philadelphia at this university. It is here, in fact, at your university that the mindset on which this Constitution is based is passed on to the next generation. Your university, home of the oldest German studies program in North America, is one of those key institutions that build bridges between our countries. President Gutmann, I am overjoyed and honored to be visiting your university today. I really have great respect for what has been and is still being achieved here. Thank you very much indeed. For me, Philadelphia is also a very special place because it was here that a great success story began. The story of those millions of Germans who became American citizens. We started at a very small level, really. 13 families from Krefeld established a settlement close by. Initially, they called it Germanopolis, subsequently renaming it Germantown. On the 6th of October 1683, that is to say, 332 years ago today, they arrived in Philadelphia Harbor with little more than their hopes for a better life and the optimism from which they drew their strength. The arrival of these families marks the start of German-American relations. And your country even commemorates this moment with a special German-American Day. We should not forget that from this very first day, nothing less than freedom was at the heart of German-American dialogue. From the outset, it was a transcontinental exchange, which involved wrestling with the nature, essence, and limits of freedom. defining and taking measure of freedom keeps us talking, even today, centuries later. And on occasion, it keeps us arguing with one another. The people from Krefeld left not only poverty and cramped conditions behind them, but also intolerance and oppression. Pennsylvania guaranteed them, as Quakers, something they had not been granted from the authorities at home: freedom of religion and conscience. The same applied to Mennonites and Labadists, to Pietists and Moravians, to Schwenkfelders and Dunkers, to all the other religious and, often as a result of their faith, political dissidents who followed the Krefeld friends. I, for one, I want to be very clear, am not aware of the details hidden behind these particular names that I've just listed. I'm not an expert either. The United States as a place of refuge for those who sought to escape from coercion and oppression in a then undemocratic Germany. In the 19th century, that was also the story of Karl Schurz and the 48ers who, following the failed March Revolution, declared, Ubi libertas, ibi patria. Where there is freedom, there is my homeland. And in the 20th century, that is the story of Hannah Arendt and Arnold Schönberg and all the other asylum seekers, above all Jews, who fled the Nazi dictatorship. However, we should not paint too one-sided a picture of the German-American dialogue on freedom, along the lines of, here was the prison, there the promised land. No, it was no coincidence that the first group of German immigrants wrote America's first anti-slavery pamphlet, thus making Germantown the birthplace of the abolitionist movement. And it was also no coincidence that German 48ers volunteered for duty in their thousands during the Civil War to free the slaves. We can therefore say that German immigrants made their contribution to help define the scope and reach of liberty in the United States. Yesterday, I heard a wonderful quote really describing that state of affairs. It goes way back in our history. It says, we German Americans can do freedom. I said something along those lines on the day where we commemorate our unification, because I said, indeed, we Germans can do freedom. Yes, we can. And I'm delighted to have come across that historical linkage here in this very place that is very rich in history. The old continent undoubtedly played a role in the arrival of slavery in America. At the same time, Europe made its mark on the New World by providing the means to overcome slavery. That is, the enlightened view of humanity. What we now call the Western community of shared values is barely conceivable without the early influence of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, yet it is also unimaginable without input from Germany. There has always been a lively exchange of ideas between the continents, a give and take of inspiration and insights. Mutual learning and mutual criticism are still instrumental in helping to modernize our countries and continents. Even today, we only need to look at America's leading universities and academic institutions, which benefit Germans and Europeans and with which we interact. Or think of America's highly developed civil society, its culture of volunteerism and its philanthropy, which we take as a role model in Europe. Just consider ideas such as consumer protection and freedom of information, environmental protection, and, if you like, even veganism, all of which have found their way to us. And conversely, German concepts, for example, the concept of a social market economy, most recently in connection with universal healthcare, influenced the debate in the United States, as do German climate protection and vocational training models. I would like to add that, for example, even Germany's car scrapping incentive was resurrected in the United States in the form of the Cash for Clunkers program. But, and that brings me to the core of what I'm trying to say, the primary, or rather the most relevant idea which developed over centuries of transatlantic interplay, starting from early European ideas, including German ones, on the separation of powers and on individuality, and extending to their codification in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, was the protection of human dignity and freedom of the individual as core element of state legitimacy. Today, the core of the body of human rights is seen to be universal. Even if this does not yet mean the same thing everywhere, it is nonetheless true that every individual on this planet can at least invoke certain inalienable rights. This is something we, Germans, that is, Europeans and Americans, can all be proud of. Whoever talks about values, however, must also mention the long revolt by both German authorities and subjects against the core of what had become the West's joint project following the Atlantic Revolution of 1776 and 1789, inalienable human rights and popular sovereignty, the rule of law and representative democracy. It's not easy. There's always been a contradiction here for a number of different reasons against these inalienable human rights, against popular sovereignty, against the rule of law, and against representative democracy. And the criminal regime of the National Socialists was the terrible culmination of the state struggle against the political consequences of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment for which German thinkers had provided such enduring inspiration. And in the 20th century, communism, certainly claiming universal reach, eventually spread as far as the center of Europe, including Germany. And it was the United States which had never allowed authoritarian rule on its own territory, which was instrumental in finally freeing the Germans from the dictatorship they had not been able to shake off on their own. Thousands upon thousands of young Americans gave their blood, gave their lives to make Europe an area of freedom once again. Together with the Allies, they rescued Germany from the German murderers, put an end to the Holocaust, and thus gave us Germans and other Europeans the chance of a new beginning. Then, of course, after that new beginning, it was also help from America, which enabled the fledgling Federal Republic to rediscover the country's liberal tradition. Anyone who watched how American soldiers behaved in Germany could see immediately that they came not as occupiers, but as liberators, which is not something one was able to say of each and every liberator at the time. When the Americans, though, sent care packages, designed the Marshall Plan, allowed free newspapers, and organized the Berlin airlift, it was clear to everyone that democracy and the rule of law were good foundations on which to build a new society and a new state. And speaking here in the United States for the first time as Germany's president, I would like to express my profound gratitude for all of this.
Besonders eindrucksvoll war,
It was particularly impressive that the victors gave the conquered the gift of trust. They believed in people's ability to leave behind the delusions and temptations of the demonic, and they invested in this belief. For me, the story of the reconstruction of the destroyed St. Michael's Church in Hildesheim is a remarkable gesture. With the encouragement of the American government and completely financed by a Jewish American businessman, work on rebuilding the church began scarcely 2 years after the end of the war and the Holocaust, at a time when just a few hundred kilometers away, the war crimes trials were still going on in Nuremberg. That, as regards the subject of trust. It became clear to the people of Germany and to me that America would stand up for the values it represented. And it became clear to me, too, particularly as someone who grew up in the Soviet occupation zone, I always felt I could count on America's determination to defend freedom, even if it strayed off the path occasionally over the years. It seemed to me reassuring and logical that when the chips were down in 1989 and 1990, that is, America was Germany's best friend. And I'd like to single out the leadership of President George H.W. Bush Sr., because no one was quicker, louder, and more sincere in calling for my country's unification than the United States at the time, under the leadership of President George W. Bush. America, which had been the guarantor of the West Germans' freedom during the Cold War, now also became the guarantor of the freedom of the East Germans and Central and Eastern Europeans, who, after many years of suffering and unsuccessful revolt, were finally able, in 1989, to say a resounding yes to and live by those values which had linked the United States and Western Europe for decades. Both as federal president and as a citizen who experienced and suffered the lack of freedom, I feel a great need here today to repeat, thank you, America. Yesterday, just a few kilometers away from here, I was able to see the Liberty Bell. There's been a replica of this bell, some of you may be aware of this, in Schöneberg Town Hall in Berlin since 1950, as an expression of our shared commitment. It's fully intact, though, in contrast to a Liberty Bell here in Philadelphia, and it does ring out occasionally. It's an expression of our shared commitment to the defense of freedom and the dignity of the individual. Let me say this, 332 years after the start of emigration, 70 years after the end of the Second World War, and 25 years after reunification, freedom buoyed by a sense of democratic responsibility, is in good hands in Germany. This freedom is the bond between our two nations.
meine Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, no one who takes a look at our shared history with all its difficulties and conflicts would be surprised that even today we witness an occasionally noisy relationship between the United States and Germany. Open societies thrive on difference of opinions. They evolve through controversy. and in the end, compromise, both internally and in relation to each other. Nevertheless, I have to confess that I'm concerned at the image of America emerging in parts of Europe and certainly in Germany, or parts of it. Reading the papers in Germany these months, you could easily get the impression that the reporting on the United States is dominated by critique. And in the majority of these cases, it concerns eavesdropping and data collection by the National Security Agency that have made people in Germany less trusting of the United States. I think during a visit like the one I am paying to your country, this needs to be mentioned too. I do and can understand that some Americans wonder why we Germans, instead of getting ourselves so worked up, don't do more ourselves to tackle terrorism, but prefer to rely on the American security services and then go on to criticize them. But allow me to turn the question round. Why do phone numbers or details of the phone calls of German cabinet secretaries, for example, of the German agriculture secretary, appear in the American services lists, and what they've got to do with terrorism and the threat it poses and countering terrorism? And why do German citizens get the impression that incursions into their private sphere are a democratically uncontrollable result of fending off a terrorist threat? It seems to me that we have not yet arrived at a viable balance of interests here. And I believe that this would be a good opportunity for the United States to win back lost trust. Some critical observers in my country, however, go much further than the question of spying. They are wondering whether a community of shared values still exists at all between our two countries, or indeed whether the United States has cut itself loose from our shared foundations. This much is sure, though. Some American standpoints are alien to many Germans. The barely restricted right to possess firearms, for example, or the death penalty, where it is in force, or the tolerance of extreme poverty and income disparities, or more recently, aspects of the security laws, but also interrogation procedures, to mention just Guantanamo. Some military interventions in the past have also triggered controversial debate in Germany. However, we should not draw the wrong conclusions from such observations. Americans are just as likely to be questioning our German interpretation of freedom from their own perspective. They find it odd that we expect others, especially the United States, to do so much to provide military defense for our own freedom and sovereignty. And that again is something I very much understand. And then there are others in America who want to know why we restrict freedom by obliging citizens always to register their place of residence with the state, which comes natural to us, you know. They wonder also why we allow the state, despite its secular neutrality, to levy taxes for religious communities and why religion is taught in state schools. As Germans, we have answers to all these questions. In many cases, good answers. But sometimes we simply do not have any responses that satisfy Americans. So it is worth taking a closer look at the topics of German-American debate. Then it becomes clear that we sometimes misinterpret what are purely political errors as the fundamental rejection of shared values. Sometimes we argue, as the German historian Heinrich August Winkler says, about different interpretations of shared values. For instance, there is a difference of opinion between Germans and Americans, but also within both societies, about the balance between the state's social responsibility on the one hand and individual initiative on the other. The same is true when it comes to the balance between individual freedom and national security. Different historical experiences ultimately lead to different priorities. That said, we each like to impose our own template on the other society. Contrasts are thus brought into sharp focus. But we should be very clear about this. The West is not a monoculture, despite the fact that we have shared values. As long as an individual's freedom is not violated, then the very concept of freedom means being able to interpret freedom. There are differences even within Europe when it comes to interpreting the same values and balancing competing values. And even within Germany, there are differences in that regard. And that's not a big drama, really, just the reflection of the rich diversity of our political culture. I believe it is the essence of pluralism. However, a good friend, in particular, enjoys the dubious privilege of the dramatic hero's fall. We expect less from a rogue than we do from a standard-bearer of democracy. Incidentally, Sigmund Freud identified this phenomenon. His theory of the narcissism of minor differences describes how otherwise similar peoples rub each other up the wrong way due to these differences. Freud saw this as a, and I quote, convenient and relatively harmless satisfaction of the inclination to aggression, end of quote. I believe that this too is the price we have to pay for being so similar. And if one of the transatlantic partners really does go astray at some point, open society always have an instrument which no other political system, form of organization can offer. That is the self-correction which comes from the heart of society, from the heart of an open society. And allow me to refer to something President Obama said recently to civil rights activists in Selma, Alabama, and I quote, "What greater form of patriotism is there than the belief that America is not yet finished, that we are strong enough to be self-critical, that each successive generation can look upon our imperfections and decide that it is in our power to remake this nation to more closely align with our highest ideals," end of quote. President Obama and the American people can rest assured that we, in Germany, as well as in all European democracies, adhere to this fundamental principle. This confidence in the never-ending democratic reform project constitutes the basis for the confidence which we can place in each other across the Atlantic. Ladies and gentlemen, 25 years after Germany's unification and the end of communism and communist rule in large parts of Europe, the world is not what we dreamed it would be back then. An age of peace has not materialized, I'm sorry to state, nor has democracy had a domino effect. Europe did experience such a phenomenon after 1989, but it did not extend much further. Instead, along the endurance of communist ideology in some places, we have witnessed the emergence of worldviews, groups and regimes whose common denominator is that they despise and actively fight pluralism. These are fundamentalists, terrorists and nihilists who incite violence, instigate conflicts, force people to flee, and bring instability into our societies. And they are autocrats, who, for having been on the defensive for such a long time, are now flexing their muscles. This is all happening around the world, even in the east of our democratic Europe. And it is clear to me that the democratic world must and indeed will renew its ties in the face of these threats. Its shared values, the similarity of its systems of government, and the similarities of its interests generate closeness and a sense of connection. Despite all the differences between our democracies, the citizens of our countries are intuitively aware whom they really can count on. And of course, politicians know that too. We can be certain that the appeal of our model of society is undiminished. The many people who, on a daily basis, are risking their lives to reach our nations, to come and live with us, provide daily proof of this. The longing for freedom of all those gathering in large squares in distant countries to call for all of those rights that we ourselves have long enjoyed, it is further proof. However, we must not stand by and do nothing. Two things are necessary: greater adherence to our principles and more partnership. Firstly, we have to learn anew to stand up for what we cherish in our hearts. In the name of respect for other religions and worldviews, some people have become accustomed to accepting practices which should not be tolerated. Universal rights are indivisible. Human dignity is not negotiable. This has consequences for the priorities of our societies. And that is not a show of Western dominance, but rather a rejection of cultural relativism. To put it in a nutshell, we have to remember those Atlantic ideas of the late 18th century on which our societies have been built during the last decades. Even if we ask ourselves as democratic nations, together and individually, what our role may be in a world of growing threats, this must not render us feeble, nor should it render us indecisive. We champion and we continue to champion the principles for which we stand, and we are prepared to let others judge us by this. If, for example, the West were to give up the idea of the universality of human rights, it would give itself up for lost. Secondly, we have to step up cooperation among the like-minded. Let us be honest. In recent years, we have not treated transatlantic relations with the care they require. After all the years of partnership, we take it for granted. We take it for granted that people from both sides of the Atlantic will come together, that the exchange of school children, students, artists, and parliamentarians will continue, that foundations, universities, and research institutions cooperate, that the world of politics, the business community, and the military are working ever more closely together. We now realize that nothing can be taken for granted, that we have to secure and defend what we have achieved every day and every day anew. We should intervene wherever a link is cut or a tried and trusted exchange program comes to an end. We have to engage in dialogue wherever the interconnected nature of our world is criticized, whether in the sphere of trade or in the sphere of defense, in migration issues, or most especially in climate change mitigation. We also have to keep on winning over the critics of this cooperation. We have to convince them that cooperation among democracies is better than isolationism. And we have to make this point at this very point in time where groups and trends are receiving support in parts of the world. And it's no longer an overall light bill that guides us. But above all, there's one thing which we in Europe need more than anything else. Ongoing American engagement, that is. The United States has been a vital player in Europe for many decades. Indeed, Europe's rebirth, and I made that point earlier, after the Second World War was made possible by the support provided by the United States. It fostered European reconciliation and facilitated or even helped launch the process of European integration by allowing Germany's incorporation into NATO. It is an anchor of security and stability, and in many cases a power booster for Europe, and thus also for Germany. The United States did all of this during the Cold War for Europe's free peoples, but it was also in its own interest, rightly understood. Some in the United States are now claiming that long-term engagement in Europe is no longer necessary. It is not my place, as German president, to define the national interests of the United States. Of course not. Perhaps, however, you will allow me to make an observation. I see Europe, a Europe surrounded by crises. I see the difficulties, including the setbacks in the European integration process, as well as the temptation in various European states to act alone as a nation-state. It is not the task of US politicians to intervene in a domineering manner in these national debates. However, I want to take this opportunity to recall the words of the late German sociologist Ulrich Beck, who felt that and I quote, merely European Europe, end of quote, as he called it, a Europe without America was in no way desirable, and what is more, that it had little chance of success. In the light of the conflicts of the past, and out of concern for the West's ability to shape tomorrow's world, the United States should take the following to heart. Engagement in and with Europe on an enduring basis remains the best conceivable investment in stability, especially when new threats are emerging.
Lassen Sie mich aus deutscher Sicht hinzufügen. Deutschland ist
Allow me to add from a German perspective. Germany is not an island, protected from all the turmoil in the world. Above all, Germany is not an island somewhere between Russia and America. Germany is fully integrated in the European Union and in the North Atlantic Alliance. Within this context, and together with our European friends, we've taken on responsibility, more responsibility than previously. And nobody should be afraid about this. Especially in Europe itself, we have taken on greater responsibility and on its periphery. However, greater German responsibility while American engagement simultaneously diminishes would not do Germany or Europe any good in the long term. Nor would it benefit the United States or the rest of the world, by the way. We need organizations to visibly embody the spirit of cooperation. We have them. However, they need to be adapted to today's world. Although the European states cultivate their relations with the United States, the European Union has not yet become the strong partner for America which it could be. And let's take a look at NATO. Despite all the new threats, NATO is not at the heart of our security dialogue on a changing world. We must not forget that the North Atlantic Alliance remains absolutely vital to the freedom of most European countries, including Germany. We have to be prepared to work to strengthen this alliance. And we have to be prepared to do that again and again. I believe freedom should be worth something to us. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the major tragedies of our age is taking place in Syria. The war has been going on for 4 years now, and hundreds of thousands are fleeing from the region. The sentiments which these refugees have about my country are the same as those which our own ancestors once had when they sailed towards the Statue of Liberty in New York. They're entering a country of hope and opportunities, of freedom and democracy. The flight to Europe and to Germany shows that in an age of swift information transfer and easy travel, as citizens of one world, we are interconnected and interdependent as never before. Closing ourselves off is not an option. It is no longer a solution, not for Germany, not for Europe, and not for America either. Anyone who is young today and studying, for example, here at the University of Pennsylvania or at a German university, has the good fortune to be born into an age of freedom and prosperity. I am certain that even in an environment full of new challenges, we have the means and instruments to peacefully prolong this era. However, we cannot do it alone. This is the great insight which President John F. Kennedy once imparted upon us here in Philadelphia. If we want to find answers today to the major issues of our time, then we will have to stand together. Freedom is our shared bond. For this reason, it is our bounden duty today, as it was in the past, to shoulder responsibility and to work with and for each other. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Dankeschön, Bundespräsident. Dankeschön.
Thank you very much.
A few questions, particularly from some of our Penn students, so I will now call on some potential questioners. Raise your hand if you've got a question. How about let's see, I see someone right here in the second seat in on the left.
Hi, good morning. My name is Erica, and I'm currently a senior here at Penn studying political science. My question to you is, during the peak of the current refugee crisis, tens and thousands of refugees are arriving in Germany every day. Can Germany effectively accommodate the recent influx of people, and what can Germany and other countries do to address the current crisis?
Can I answer in German?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Germany and the Chancellor has not left any doubt that we feel that we are up to the challenge to receive the refugees in Germany, at least those who have a right to stay. There are persons who come because they are looking for a better life. Those don't have a legal entitlement to stay. One can allow it or one can disallow it, but those who are asylum seekers who have valid asylum reasons have a secure legal basis to remain in Germany. Germany will integrate these people. What is being debated in Germany right now is the question to what extent we can receive refugees in Germany today. The Federal Republic has learned painfully over decades to become something that it never wanted to be, namely an immigration country. When I come here to the United States or to Canada, then you feel that there's a cultural climate that considers immigration as something that is quite normal. And this feeling developed relatively late in West Germany, and it is now uncontested that we are indeed an immigration country. There are still cultural reservations to mass immigration, and those are usually based on prejudices, but there are also concrete concerns. There, for example, mayors in some of the towns and cities that receive refugees are now reaching the limits of what can be done with respect to providing housing, with respect to providing jobs. And if not everyone works, then this strong social network might not be as secure as it once was. And these are concerns that Germans are now expressing toward politicians. And at the moment we have a debate in Germany whether we should say that there's a limited number of refugees we can receive. The constitution does not limit the immigration of the reception of refugees, and that has to do with the history of Germany. When Thomas Mann described that, it was really important for the survival of the Jews who emigrated. And the framers of the constitution in Germany had this in their head when they incorporated this article in the German constitution. So I don't see a political force that's going to change this in Germany right now. What we need to do is we have to create the legal basis that is possible to handle this problem of refugees. And the German policy is now always appealing to its European friends and neighbors, please do your part. And the European Union has made some decisions. The European Parliament, the European Council are trying to also invite the other member states to do more, to accept more refugees, mostly the newly acceded countries from Eastern Europe that have particularly big problems, because similar to the East Germans, they didn't have this long experience of immigration that worked. And of course, if you are faced with people that you don't know, that you're not familiar with, then there's more xenophobia. There is an anti-Semitism without Jews, and there's also xenophobia without foreigners. And this is something that we see in Europe, that coexists in Europe. There's an open culture of the working together, but there's also a culture of reservation, of waiting how things will develop. But Germany wants to be a nation that lives up to its responsibility. Of course, I'm now here in the United States, and it would be good that we could have a conversation about refugees, not only within Europe, because the Americans were active in the Near East in order to change things, in order to topple dictators, in order to create new societies. And of course, this has created a flow of refugees. This is the fact, and you cannot change this. This is and we're really hoping for a stronger cooperation between German and American politics in order to cope with this problem and find a solution.
In the middle here. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Laura Cerise. I'm a senior at Penn studying political science. Germany has played a critical role in addressing the situation with Russia and Ukraine. I was wondering what you see as the United States' potential future role in the region, especially with the Ukrainian and Russian conflict.
Ich habe vor
1.5 years ago, I spoke at the Munich Security Conference, and I asked my compatriots to think about their own role and to be prepared to accept more responsibility and in an emergency, and of course mandated by the United Nations, also for military intervention. And people called me a warmonger after this speech, but my concern was not to increase the German military involvement. Of course, that might be possible, might be necessary within a good partnership. But what I was concerned about is I wanted to wake my country up from a political adolescence, that we have to recognize that we have grown up and compared to others. And comparison always teaches us knowledge and insights that we don't get otherwise. And compared to other nations with whom we are at the same level economically and politically, we have now come into a different role, a role that opens up new possibilities. You have to understand that Germany, its post-war history and war history, is afraid of the term leadership, Führung. This was a burnt word. This was a taboo. And a new generation of politicians has to understand that leadership is not always connected with something that's negative. And in this process of shaping our own national identity, this is what our country now finds itself in. And the active role that Germany plays, for example, in the Ukraine conflict or in the participation in the negotiations in Iran, I can only praise this participation. It's not defeatism, as some circles in the United States seem to believe, but it's not defeatism. But if the Chancellor and the Foreign Minister, with respect to the Ukraine, in cooperation with the American friends, are excluding a military solution, then you have to ask yourself whether you are benefiting the situation or damaging the situation with steps of military escalation. And I think the Germans have pursued a very rational and not a defensive or defeatist policy. They are acting responsibly, diplomatically, and none of you has to believe that Angela Merkel or Frank-Walter Steinmeier, our foreign minister, do not recognize Putin in the Kremlin. Nobody should expect that Germany wants to be in an equidistant position between Germany and Russia. That's not German policy. But it is not my place to criticize, censure, or praise our federal government. But I have to answer your question. I'm very interested in a role of responsibility, which conforms to our position, and I don't think we can flee from this responsibility. We have to understand, we have to see how we can achieve, how we can be successful among global players who do not share our values and who threaten others with military means, who would try to expand their influence. We have to first try a peaceful strategy. We have to try to isolate them, and we have to try to make them, we have to drive them to make concessions. Why? And that is the reason why Angela Merkel and Frank-Walter Steinmeier are working so hard on negotiation, on talking to each other. They are not taking flight, believe me.
So I wish we had time for more questions, but I know we're already about 7 minutes over. So on that note, I want to invite Dr. Gutmann back to the stage.
So I think, in fact, I know you will all want to join me in thanking President Gauck, the entire German delegation, for making a historic trip to Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania, and the United States, and offering us incredible insights into both the possibilities of our world, but also the problems that we have to deal with together. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite cartoons. You'll bear with me a moment. When President Gauck talked about how important our shared values are, but how we must not lose sight of them and put them to work, how we must put them to work in the world, I saw this picture of the cartoon of a little boy, an American boy, tugging on the coattails of Thomas Jefferson and looking up at Thomas Jefferson and saying, if you take these truths to be self-evident, these are the truths of all men are created equal, then why do you keep harping on them so much? And the answer to that at the time was those truths that were taken to be self-evident stood in contrast to the practice of slavery that was going on and that Thomas Jefferson himself was practicing. What President Gauck has presented us today are our highest shared values as contrasted to some of the biggest problems that we face in the world. And we face them together. And he came here, and he comes to us in the spirit of wisdom and cooperation. And for that, and for so much more, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts and the top of our minds. Thank you so very, very much. And welcome at any time.
Thank you.